Like most of the internet, I spent my Monday night watching the 2 hour debate between Piers Morgan and Nick Fuentes. And if you didn't watch it, well, look to the following screenshot for how it went for each party. This is right at the end. Nick was smiling like the cat that got the cream, and Piers Morgan was scowling because his attempt to play back footage from Nick's own show and put Nick on the spot and get him to disavow himself and be in a moral double bind didn't work. And the reason why Nick Fuentes is so popular is a mystery to people over the age of about 30. We're speaking in broad generalities here. And I think it's worthwhile me, as a young man the same age as Nick, explaining to people who are in my audience and a bit older why this went so badly for Piers Morgan and why Nick Fuentes, even if people my age don't like him, don't find him as shocking as older people do. And I'm noticing the reason why Piers Morgan felt so determined to destroy Nick Fuentes, why none of his moral blows landed with Fuentes, and why older people find Fuentes so repugnant is twofold. Number one, because they mainly watch the clips of his show rather than watching a full show, so they don't really understand how he deploys hyperbole and comedy to deliberately provoke moral taboos. But also, they have a lot emotionally invested in the post war liberal order. And so they see anything which threatens the consolidated gains of the sexual revolution and the civil rights movement and anti racism and the open society as an unlocking of Pandora's box to unleash Nazism on the world again, because of the belief that any constraint on the individual, any noticing of differences, any preferences expressed by a white man for his heritage, his identity, his people, his country, and his culture leads ineluctably to fascism and gas chambers. And that just isn't the case. And I think there's quite a few people my age who look at the society that they've inherited, who, no matter how hard they try, they are told they are the avatars of inexpungible historical racial guilt, that they, if they are a heterosexual white man, are responsible for all the oppression in the world, and they are made second class citizens in their culture and their own civilizations, despite having to bear the disproportionate tax burden for all of these redistributive social programs for irresponsible single mothers and malcontented minorities and various sexual identity groups, and picking up the pieces of their broken lifestyles and poor choices. And they think, well, if I'm only ever going to be called racist, sexist, homophobic, and inherently sinful, no matter what I do, and every other group can play identity politics at my expense, and it's creating a society which is poorer and less coherent and less wholesome than that my grandparents enjoyed, what do I have to lose by turning over the tables of this moral order entirely? What do I have to lose by being called all of these woke shibboleths and shrugging and smiling and not accepting the yoke of this moral order and any power it has over me? And so this is why you get Nick Fuentes smugly smirking as Piers Morgan spends 2 hours grilling him on sexism and racism and slurs that he said on live streams and edgy jokes he's made about the Holocaust. And some of these are genuinely jokes, by the way, and this is something that I think a lot of people who do have a sincere horror at the atrocities of the 20th century, as I do, feel uncomfortable about. But I'll try and explain them. But first, on the idea that the boomer and zoomer morality is incommunicable, Piers Morgan, after this, kept, because I think he wasn't happy with his own performance, reiterating on Twitter how Fuentes had admitted to being a racist, as if this was Piers's ultimate gotcha. Fuentes had embraced the label racist, and therefore anything he says from there on out should be dismissed by all reasonable people. This is much like when Kelly J. Keane went on the show and Piers Morgan called her a transphobe, and she said, "Yeah, I am a transphobe." by your standard, because I don't think that men can become women, and I don't think that self-identifying transsexuals should be entering women's private spaces and entering their sports teams. And over time, Kelly J. Keane has been vindicated, and Piers Morgan, recognizing the political direction of travel and his ability to make money from political debates depends on it, has caught up with her position. But he was happy to use the slurs at the time because he thought he was occupying the safe space in the Overton window. And the same goes for racist here, because, as I pointed out underneath this post, the term racist has been used as a silencer for many years now, and so it has been contorted beyond all meaning when organizations said that milk is racist, that disparities in income between any group, no matter that group's actions or productivity, is racist, and that conversations in Britain about the Pakistani grooming gang scandal, that is still ongoing, by the way, and the ethnic and religious composition of the gangs versus their victims, that was called racist for a very long time. Still is. And that silenced conversations about the abuse for 5 decades and meant that thousands of girls have been abused. And that is a direct consequence of the immigration policy that Piers Morgan said he recently supported because diversity made London stronger and Britain's food is now better, when he was challenged on why he thought that Britain becoming less white English was a form of evolution by Tucker Carlson. So Piers Morgan is upholding the same moral order and using the same slurs that have made heterosexual white men second-class citizens in their own country, that has made them public enemy number one of the woke moral orthodoxy. And then he's wondering why that same term, racist, hasn't immediately put Nick Fuentes' audience off of him. It's because Nick Fuentes is an accurate representation of a large amount of the young men that watch him. Now, there are also a lot of young black men and a lot of Muslims that watch him. One, because Gen Z is the most diverse generation on record. But two, as Nick said, do you think black people want to get shot by other black people? There are enterprising black people living in the hood and the ghetto, and the first thing they do when they make some money is move out. This is why Nick and Kanye West have become good friends. This is why Nick grew up listening to Kanye West. It's because that's the first thing that Kanye West did. He wasn't exactly the most impoverished black chap in Chicago, but as a black man in Chicago, it's impossible to be entirely divorced from the gang culture that teenage boys get into and often end up in jail before, or juvie, before they've even made it out of high school. And so the first thing that Kanye West was singing about and rapping about was, yes, going to college, yes, dropping out, having his heart broken, but also how the music and entertainment industry was enslaving black artists with new chains, getting them to waste their wealth on extravagant status displays rather than fostering intergenerational wealth, keeping families together, dipping in and out of prison by committing violent crime and stopping the black community from being able to get itself on its feet. And so that's why a lot of young black men listen to Nick Fuentes as well as young white men. And Piers Morgan just can't understand this because Nick Fuentes is willing to transgress the post-war moral order that says noticing differences between groups, but being unwilling to pretend that the blank slate exists, being unwilling to entertain the prospect that if we all just held our hands and shut our eyes, we'd live in John Lennon's Imagine. Being unwilling to do that leads ineluctably to the atrocities of Nazi Germany. And not only do these young men not agree with that, but they would rather be called a racist than be party to all of the horrors in civilization that anti-racism has enabled. The Pakistani grooming gangs, the murder of Iriana Zarutska by DeCarlos Brown Jr., who was meant to be in prison but repeatedly let out by a permissive criminal justice system which is founded on two principles. One, believing we're all blank slates, and so somewhere along the life of a criminal, society has failed him, so we must pursue restorative rather than retributive justice, and that if there is any disparity in the rates of criminality between black and white, that's because the white people have oppressed the black people, and so we have to be more permissive to black people as an identity category. Because again, if we just are tolerant and compassionate and loving, we will all be equal because we're all blank slates deep down. And so, why should we uphold this moral order that has visited horrors upon us and the people that we love, just because we're afraid of being called racist? You can only use that term so long without a shared definition when other people have used it to cover up those atrocities and expect it to work until someone comes along and just goes, I don't care, call me racist if you like, I care more about fixing the problems in my country than the names that you have called me. And this is what Fuentes actually said in his post-debate victory lap stream. He went, yes, I'm racist, yes, I'm misogynistic, now what? But what he's saying is, yes, he is racist and misogynistic by the standards that the post-war moral order that insists we are all blank slates sets. Yes, he is willing to notice differences. Yes, he's willing to use coarse language. Yes, he's willing to talk about groups rather than abstract individuals in a way that can put a negative judgment on minority groups, rather than the inverse liberal morality, which can only ever acknowledge the existence of groups when it's acknowledging that minorities are oppressed and majorities are to be regarded with suspicion as their perennial oppressors. So the state must exist to redress these grievances, to rectify imbalances between groups, and aim for equality. Fundamentally, Nick Fuentes is not an egalitarian. And so this is the great sin that he has committed, as well as using plosive and provocative language before his debate with Piers Morgan. And this is why Piers Morgan was bringing up all of these clips saying, hey, you've noticed differences here. Hey, you've used this language here. Isn't this a violation, a sin against the post-war moral order? And Nick, being outside that moral order, Nick's audience, his massive audience, gets like 1 million viewers per live stream now. They're outside that moral order as well, and so none of the blows landed from Piers Morgan. And that's just the civil rights movement. The sexual revolution came up, and this seemed to be the sorest spot for Piers Morgan, and it's because people have noticed that Piers Morgan's wife seems to have a degree of contempt for him. She didn't actually want to date him in the stories that she retells of their courtship. She persistently posts about wanting pool boys or having black men in Speedos wash her car and insinuates that she's cheating on him. She took like a 6-week sabbatical from their marriage. And this is all public, by the way. And this is not something I knew when I went on Piers Morgan's show in 2021 and I gave, well, in hindsight, is a rather weak opener on the Me Too issue, where I said, well, I'm sure, you being a provocative, loudmouth man, Piers, means that women have always been interested in you because women like a courageous, provocative, loudmouth man. Can attest to that. And I'm sure Nick can too, because despite the rumours surrounding his sexuality that Piers Morgan brought up when he asked him if he was gay, Nick undoubtedly does have women making propositions to him, given his wealth, status, and success. I mean, they send super chats in frequently. But I don't think Piers Morgan enjoys the same luxury. And this is why I don't think, as well, Piers Morgan is an effective messenger for the post-war moral order, even though he's a man that's been perfectly shaped by it. Because if you are not personally virtuous, just reciting these post-war moral shibboleths will not shame a young man into having respect for you. Because he can look at you and he can see that you're overweight, you're emotionally incontinent, your career has not made the country a better place, you seem to be personally enriching yourself off of the atrocities and the hyper-real nature of modern politics that never seems to solve any problems. And so why would he take a lecture from you when you don't seem capable of fixing the problems that you really did nothing about across the lifetime that you were actually involved in politics and journalism, and that you didn't stop coming to pass? So when Piers Morgan says here, I'm going to start branding those who shame women who stand up for women's rights women-phobic, yeah, great. I'm sure this is going to resonate with men that you accuse of hypocrisy who have spent the last 20 to 30 years of their lives going through state institutions that have taken on a very feminine character in reputation destruction, in always considering violence and strength as an immoral response to problems, in encouraging an outpouring of feelings, in stigmatizing any display of masculine competence or competition as the source of inequality and oppression. I'm sure all of those men will be really susceptible to your argument, Piers, that they're just not respecting women enough. I'm sure they'll be susceptible to that argument coming from you, whose wife doesn't seem to have much respect for him, rather than Nick Fuentes, who, and I hate to drop my wife in it, but we watched the debate together, and when Piers pulled up the clip of saying, you really think that women want to be assaulted? And Nick clarified, saying, well, they want an aggressive man, and this is part of their fantasies. She was laughing and saying it was true. We've all met women like this. I mean, unlike Nick, I was not celibate before I got married, before my sins, and we have all met women who quite like a strong man. Including Piers Morgan's wife, probably. She just doesn't consider him to be that strong man. And so when the likes of the New York Post, again, try to capitalize on the outrage cycle by clipping this and saying, infamous woman hater Nick Fuentes admits to being a virgin, what they're doing here is they're appealing to the gains of the sexual revolution and what is euphemized as women's liberation, but what that actually means is women's liberation from any dependency on men, even though men still want to be dependent on women, form relationships with them, have families. It's the number one priority that Republican men have said, having a wife and a family in their lives, according to a recent NBC poll. And those are the exact kind of young men that watch Nick Fuentes. What this is appealing to is a consolidation of the sexual revolution being correct. And I'm sorry, but lots of young women are now revisiting that settlement because promiscuity and hookups, the zipless, if you finish the acronym, from Erica Zhong's Fear of Flying, people are realizing that's just led to dispassion, antagonisms between the sexes, the fragmentation of families, fatherless homes, rising crime, increasing in abortions, more STDs being spread, more out-of-wedlock births, fewer children overall, and the complete disintegration of society. And so, shaming Nick Fuentes for staying celibate before he gets married, again, is not a point of shame for our generation. Like, our generation despises pornography. And if you think that hypersexuality is the way to win these young men over who have been preyed upon throughout their childhood by a company that knows that it's targeting to children, it knows it induces erectile dysfunction, it knows that it contorts their view of the world to become obsessed with different gender and sexual identities and basically spiritually or chemically castrates them if they go far enough. If you think that appealing to those men on the grounds of, well, you should even be even more hypersexualized is going to persuade them, you're completely out of touch. Also, as a brief aside, as a Catholic, Piers Morgan doesn't get to claim to be Catholic. He told Tucker Carlson that he supports a woman's right to choose, which means he supports abortion, which is a mortal sin for which he should be denied communion. And then he attempted to insult Nick Fuentes for being misogynistic incel because he's abstinent before marriage. Again, in this regard, Nick's a better Catholic than me because I didn't listen to his advice about no e-girls ever for my sins. But if Piers Morgan is a Catholic, and not just a Catholic in the, Tony Blair sense, or the Nancy Pelosi sense, or the Joe Biden sense, which means not at all, then why would he be shaming a young man for following church teaching on sexual morality? He's not. He's just a boomer liberal progressive who attempts to wear your religion like a skin suit, and religion, to him, just means a proto-form of liberalism that didn't get it quite right, but that he can appeal to get you to agree with him. It's just sophistry. And so, none of these attacks have landed on Nick, none of them have distanced him from his audience, and if anything, despite his provocative language, which we'll get onto in a moment, this has just amplified him to a whole new audience, and this is why the existing media class, the liberal establishment, both the sort of neoconservatives in the Republican Party, the Bush and Romney types that tried to cancel him initially when Tucker spoke to him, and now Piers Morgan, the sort of avatar of boomer liberalism who would trade our birthright for authentic poppadoms and curse us on his deathbed and say, you're not going to get your inheritance now past the naan bread. That's why none of these people have been able to cancel him, because the constituency they're appealing to carry out Nick's cancellation, his own audience, don't see them as legitimate moral actors, but they do see Nick as an imperfect champion for their cause. And that cause is, as Nick brought up during the debate, the demolition of the post-war moral order that sees them as the villains of history and therefore deserving of no inheritance, no legitimate place in society, no meaningful work, no wife, no family, no legacy. No virtue. They are simply to be discarded in the dustbin of history, and in their remaining time on this earth before they can be demographically replaced, have all their hard work plundered and given to the various client groups that make up the natural constituencies, the natural dependents of the total managerial liberal state. And I'm sorry, but we just don't want to do that. Thank you very much. And that point is what Nick made when he brought up the post-war consensus, the open society. He mentioned Karl Popper. He wasn't just referring to George Soros's international leftist sponsorship network. Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies was written in the aftermath of the Second World War, and Popper went through the history of philosophy and laid blame at the feet of Plato's Republic, which I think is pretty true, for a totalitarian instinct that lays dormant in societies. Now, what Popper was incorrect about was that complete openness, a disintegration of hard boundaries around identity, ethnicity, race, religion, sex, sexuality, nations, all of these things must be liquidated so that imposing hard limits on what we presume to be an egalitarian human nature doesn't lead from difference to animosity, to totalitarian regimes that then scapegoat other ethnic groups, to then concentration camps and gas chambers and another Holocaust. This is why, throughout his work, Karl Popper obsessed about racialists. This is why Adolf Hitler has become the secular Satan ever since the 20th century. It's because the only antidote to the resurrection of the guard towers of Dachau and Auschwitz has been prescribed to be the open society. No limits on anyone's individual freedom, no dependency on one another, a total full-throated belief in the blank slate in practice, even if you haven't read the core texts of liberalism from Locke and Rousseau. So we have to insist that everyone is equal deep down, that any differences between groups are the consequence of education, geography, economics, culture, or arbitrary bigotry and prejudice if we've rectified all of those other differences, or the state is engaged in an enterprise of egalitarian redress, and anyone who notices those differences is, in Schrodinger's fashion, actually creating inequality rather than observing inequality, and they are the reason why we don't have utopia yet. They are the reason why Nazism looms ever on the horizon. And this was present in the debate when Piers Morgan said to Nick Fuentes, well, what a lot of people are going to hear when they listen to this debate is you saying you're a racist, and therefore your assessment of these problems, you know, his ability to understand per capita where Piers Morgan couldn't, about the respective levels of violent crime committed by young black men versus young white men, that is all viewed through the prism of arbitrary racial bigotry, through the prism of just hating someone just because they look different to you, rather than understanding that acknowledging differences exist is a consequence of empirically noticing patterns of behavior between groups, that young black men happen to commit violent crime more than young white men. Now, whether or not you provide a hard-bordered ethnic or racial explanation for that, a biological explanation, or a purely sociological, economic, cultural explanation for that, well, that's then downstream of noticing the differences in the first place. But you don't get to acknowledge the problem without noticing the difference. You don't get to solve the problem without noticing the difference. Whereas Piers Morgan is saying noticing the difference is either creating the problem or just makes him feel offended, and therefore we can't talk about it on a show titled Uncensored, and therefore you have to accept this horrendous state of affairs where white people are getting killed by black people, like Austin Metcalf or Iriana Zarutska, or the number of children that have been killed by random black people in the last few years, or all the businesses that were burned down during Black Lives Matter in 2020, after the Michael Brown riots, after the Trayvon Martin scandal. You have to accept all of this, otherwise we're just going to sit there and call you racist. And again, they would rather be called racist and solve the problem. They would rather notice differences and be willing to transgress post-war morality than allow these atrocities to continue. And you don't actually have to get this from Nick Fuentes, by the way, if you find his delivery offensive or bombastic or hyperbolic rather than funny. And just an aside, pretty much every young man, even the people that don't agree with Fuentes politically, do not find this shocking because we grew up on the internet. Many Zoomers grew up on Discord. It was before my time. But I grew up playing Call of Duty. If you were in a Modern Warfare 2 or 3 lobby, if you were playing Black Ops 1 or 2, you heard far worse than what Nick Fuentes says on his show, and you probably said it to your friends. And actually, Fuentes' show acts as a kind of cathartic sigh of relief for young men who want to be engaged in that banter again, but in the age of the camera phone, in the age of screen recording, in the age of social media, could be cancelled and have an offhand remark written as if it's on a tablet of stone, posted on social media, that lives there forever, and they're unable to feel like they can make a joke or even make an error in this climate. And so they actually enjoy someone who's willing to be cancelled from literally everywhere. Before Rumble came along, he was streaming on his own website, Cozy TV. They're happy for someone to have spent 10 years living in his basement, saying offensive things, just so we can all breathe a sigh of relief again. Just so we can all say the word retard and other words that I can't say on YouTube again. Young men are willing to offend you to have the right to offend their friends. Because the alternative is, again, upholding a moral order that says they are responsible for all the sins of history, and that they don't get to make jokes anymore because it might offend a minority hypothetically somewhere. And I had this firsthand. Actually, I've told this story before, but at university, we had a free speech society. It was very tepid, other than inviting my friend Carl Benjamin, who Nick said he would like to sit down with, so it'll be an interesting conversation. But also, we invited Jake Rees-Mogg to talk about Brexit. We invited an Israeli and a Palestinian ambassador to debate the conflict over there at the time, and this was back in 2018 or 19. So this was before October the 7th. And we were attacked by a local Antifa chapter. We had screenshots from the chat doctored and leaked to make it look like we were supporting the Christchurch shooting. We had a local MP, Rosie Duffield, condemn us before, the crocodile came for her too, and during the trans issue, Antifa turned on her. We had the BBC write about us. We had members fined for offending the diversity coordinator. There was a whole struggle session with the student union and the head of diversity inclusion, despite the head of the student union being in a group chat with Antifa members that said they wanted to start fights at our events to get the pretext to shut us down. We had the sports centre defaced with threats towards us. We had members who had to undergo diversity training to remain in the university. And do you know what happened then? I decided, if you're going to do that, then no, I'm not going to cave to pressure. I'm actually going to get involved in politics to spite you, to make sure you can't do this to another young man again. To make sure that you don't get to turn around and say, you can't make jokes about this and that, because it's actually a Nazi recruiting tool that is cited in Daily Stormer, which was actually a conversation the diversity coordinator had in the session. She said, I've read an article from the Daily Stormer that says that 4chan uses Pepe memes and the OK hand signal and jokes to recruit young men to neo-Nazism. So I think these jokes you're making in your group chat mean that you're a neo-Nazi. And we actually had to entertain that farce. We had to sit there and pretend, because they held power over us, because some people wouldn't have been able to have their degrees otherwise. They wouldn't have been able to attend their graduation ceremony. They wouldn't have been able to complete their course. We had to sit there and pretend that they had any moral legitimacy purely because they were wielding power over us. They knew what they were doing, and they were enforcing ideology through raw power. And you know what? That engenders so much resentment that eventually you're going to create champions of an anti-woke, anti-censorious cause who are willing to say literally everything just to offend you, just to get you to react. You're going to end up getting the likes of Nick Fuentes and millions of people who watch it. And again, if you don't like Nick Fuentes' delivery, you can instead read Return of the Strong Gods by R.R. Reno, a very mainstream Catholic conservative who is friends with Yoram Hazony, who Nick doesn't like, who is a Jewish intellectual, who is friends with J.D. Vance, who runs the National Conservative Movement. R.R. Reno's been interviewed by Winston Marshall. You can't really get more mainstream than that in Britain. And he says almost the exact same thing that Fuentes did about the post-war moral order in his interview with Piers Morgan. Now, the thing that's really set people off during the interview with Piers Morgan was that Nick Fuentes had said, Hitler was cool. And when asked why, he said, the edits, the aesthetics of the uniforms. And he actually followed up on this in the following show, the post show that he did about the debate. And I won't play any clips in case playing something from Nick Fuentes gets my channel banned because he's still banned on YouTube. But go and watch the show if you want his take on it on Rumble. But he said, the Hitler hype edits do not represent young people's desire to engage in a second Holocaust. They represent young people's desire, young white men especially, and some women and some anti-woke minorities that are sick to death of being patronized, or patronized, rather than patronized. They represent this desire for young white men to just go, no, fuck you, actually. I will deliberately offend you just to show that you don't have any power over me, and then I will pursue excellence. I will pursue beautiful aesthetics because everything around me is crumbling to dust and ugly. I will stick my thumb in the eye of egalitarianism. I will be competitive. I will aspire to something greater. I will not accept the liquidation of my culture down to a indistinguishable grey goo of multiculturalism that is digestible to everyone from all times and all places. I will say I love my people, my heritage, my history, and my identity. Now, I happen to be a squishy moderate and an Englishman, and so I don't think we actually need to embrace the enemy's framing and use Hitler to do that. But the reason Hitler, the Holocaust, has become a tool of provocation by Nick Fuentes, by people that are making the hype edits, is because it is the center of gravity around which the post-war moral order spins. It is the raison d'etre for pursuing the state of Israel. It is the reason for what I think is an unsustainable double standard between the existence of Israel and the existence of open borders, open societies, liberal, progressive, multicultural countries in the Anglosphere, the UK, US, Canada, Australia, and Europe. Because Israel gets to exist as a state of exception, quite literally, to protect the Jewish people, because there is this underlying suspicion in the post-war moral order that if white people from any country, despite their different ethnic traditions between the French, the Italians, the Irish, the Spanish, the Germans, the English, and the Americans, if white people feel they have something to be proud about, or even grateful to inherit, if they feel they have something particular about their civilizations that excludes other people, if they feel they have something worth encouraging and preserving and protecting and passing along to their ancestors, then that will lead ineluctably to the persecution of Jews and another Holocaust. So Jews get to have a state to protect their ethnic people, to practice their religion in, and they get to enjoy the patronage of America and various other countries that give them aid and military protection, that show deference to their religious festivals in Europe, America, etc., that have large Jewish diasporas that play identity politics on behalf of the global Jewish diaspora or the State of Israel in their politics outside the State of Israel. But if young white men collectively organize, they bargain, they say, no, our identity is exclusive. It is as exclusive as the Jewish identity is. It is as long and historically rooted as the Jewish identity is. And we would quite like our countries to have the same standard of Israel to protect ourselves, to say that we are a nation for our own people. Then they are denigrated and cancelled and cast out of polite society and accused of being racist, fascist, Nazi, the second incarnation of Adolf Hitler. This is what academic Eric Kaufmann, again, himself Jewish, so this isn't just the domain of online neo-Nazis, calls fascist scare. It's in his book Taboo, and he says this is one of the central pillars of woke morality. And he defines woke as the making sacred of racial, sexual minority groups. It is the recognition, again, that these groups exist under permanent strain and live under the permanent threat of persecution from heterosexual white minorities and the men that will carry out those atrocities. And so this is what international law is set up to do. It's set up to protect minority groups. This is what the modern state, this is what culture is set up to do, to obsess about the status, the feelings, the wealth and well-being of racial, sexual, and religious minority groups at the expense of straight white Christian men. And you can only do that for so long. You can only say that groups can collectively organize at your expense before the men who are the furthest from the inciting incident, the Second World War and the Holocaust, who have a means now via the internet to collectively organize and share opinions and interests. Before, they go, well, why don't we form a group of our own? And if we form a group, we get called racist. But if we don't form a group, we also get called racist. So we may as well form the group. And you know what? We're probably going to form the best group because we're still the majority. We're still, historically, the most successful and competent civilizations that have ever existed. And if you decide to call us names, we are going to deliberately wind you up, deliberately insult you, and laugh as you get really worked up about it. We are going to do, basically, this. This is Zoomer versus Boomer politics in a still image. Print it, hang it in the Louvre. This sums up the political plate tectonics that are shifting at the moment. The Zoomer who just doesn't care anymore because he has inherited next to nothing, he can look forward to having next to nothing, possibly not even a wife and children of his own. And I hope that Nick does. Again, I'm the same age, so I'm not talking down to him. Actually finding a woman with whom you can share a life, and hopefully, God willing, you know, me having kids next year, it actually buttresses your feeling of going out and improving the world and saving your people and your civilization, rather than it does detract from it. It doesn't distract, it adds. So I hope that Nick does meet someone, or if he's keeping it quiet, of course, because of the amount of threats against his life, that's perfectly understandable. But this is what young men now feel the need to do, because they've had nothing promised to them. They inherited nothing. They're going to pass on nothing, if they have a family at all to pass anything on to. And they have nothing to lose by rejecting the woke scolding of unimpressive, soft, craven men like Piers Morgan, who sat idly by, enriched themselves, while the country fell apart around them. And has given them nothing, and then continues to promise to give them nothing, because they would rather eat curry than do something about the demographics and the crime and the dilapidated economy and the unrecognizable culture in their countries. And so that's why it was the worst possible strategy imaginable to bring Danny Finkelstein on to lecture Nick Fuentes about the Holocaust and the Holodomor. Because Nick Fuentes provocatively says that he likes Stalin and Hitler. And he clarified this in an interview with Stephen Crowder. And by the way, people that are saying this, that Nick Fuentes is just playing Mott and Bailey, he's just presenting one identity to the world, and then on his show he says something different. By the way, both of them are free, both of them anyone can watch at any time. They're clipped incessantly, so it's not like people don't know what he's actually saying. And just as someone who gets misinterpreted a lot on the internet and finds it annoying because you can't disprove someone when they're just accusing you of lying, I have no reason to believe that Nick Fuentes doesn't believe what he says. He just dresses it up in hyperbole and insults and comedy to make it an entertaining show, right? So to have Danny Finkelstein come on and then lecture Nick about his tragic family backstory about his mother and father being persecuted by Hitler and Stalin, it completely misses the mark, because the reason that Nick is bringing up Hitler and Stalin is to provoke the post-war moral order that has conferred no benefits onto straight white young men, but, and this is a taboo topic, has conferred enormous benefits on Lord Danny Finkelstein, the accomplished author, very wealthy, and who, if things do go badly in Britain, has Israel to live in as a country that serves his ethnic interests and protects his people. Whereas England, which he demands be liberal and multicultural, does not. And if you think I'm mischaracterizing Danny Finkelstein here, when those young men do organize along the lines of collective identity, he uses the woke right slur. He has called for censorship across social media of people he accuses of being Holocaust deniers, which would probably fit Nick Fuentes because of the jokes that he's made about it. And he includes in here Sarah Pochin, the Reform MP, who said, "I'm sick of seeing an overrepresentation of black and Asian people in British adverts when the majority of people in Britain are not black or Asian, and the majority of relationships are not interethnic. They're actually monoethnic. They're between English people." And he says she's a member of the woke right, which is just another euphemism for Nazi. It just means racist. It just means fascist. It just means, ultimately, you have transgressed against the post-war moral order that says we can't notice any differences between groups unless we're blaming white people for everything and giving their money to black people. Unless we're blaming white people, collectively, for the atrocities of history and saying Jews exist as a group and deserve a state of their own, and special protections and privileges as a diaspora outside of Israel. And for all Danny Finkelstein's complaints about the jokes that Nick Fuentes has made, the transgressions he is willing to do against the post-war moral order, I encourage Danny Finkelstein to read one of his own articles. There is no future in the politics of victimhood. Now, it is curious that this article was written to only, again, apply to white English people who are complaining about the immigrants that are being placed in their towns and cities. This was written in response to the protests outside the Asylum Hotel in Epping, the Bell Hotel, after the Ethiopian sex offender Hadush Kabatu broke into the country and 8 days later decided to sexually proposition a 14-year-old schoolgirl in uniform as well as other women. This was written to say, well, maybe you shouldn't go out and protest and make all of those migrant criminals feel uncomfortable. You shouldn't form a collective ethnic English identity and say that we, the English, have an interest that we would like politicians to recognise. But, Danny, if there was no future in the politics of victimhood, then you wouldn't be depicting your mother and father as the victims of the atrocities of the 20th century to try to either appeal morally or shame Nick Fuentes, because you are positioning yourself and your parents and the Jewish people as victims, and they were undoubtedly victims of the Holocaust, of course. But if there were no future in the politics of victimhood, you wouldn't be using it to suit your own ends. And if there were no future in the politics of victimhood, then Israel wouldn't exist. And so, what white young men are doing, trying to explain to people who don't understand the Nick Fuentes phenomenon, is recognizing they are not victims, but they have been victimized, they've been stigmatized, they've been systemically disadvantaged. They recognize that the slurs thrown at them by the people who uphold and benefit from that moral order will always be thrown at them, no matter what they do, and that they are a way of keeping them in place because it advantages the people that are using the slurs, including Piers Morgan, who's made a lot of money as a journalist upholding the existing moral order and only tepidly challenging it when it benefits him. And so they've realised those slurs don't have any power. Everyone else is willing to self-identify as a victim, to take my money, to take political power, to insult me, to take my country from me. So you know what? I'm going to recognise the ways in which I have been wronged. I can actually point to evidence of them rather than just blaming the systemic conspiracy of patriarchy or whiteness or cis heteronormativity. I can point to things like affirmative action, DEI, the Civil Rights Act, the Race Relations Act, the Equality Act, the replacement of fictional and historical characters with people of different ethnicities and sexualities and genders. The erasure of my own identity, the prying it apart to encompass its antonyms, the redefinition of my heritage to be a set of bland liberal values that anywhere, from any time, someone can assent to, but even murderers who break those liberal values are still afforded just because they happen to have been born here. So, I think all of those men that recognise those conditions say, well, if you're saying you're aggrieved and you're entitled to political representation, recognition, and redress of grievances, I think we are too. And I think we won't be shut down by insults and slurs going forwards. And I think, actually, we're going to elect an avatar of our concerns organically by what they watch, what they upvote on Twitter when he's ratioing Elon Musk. And it doesn't matter how offended you get, we're not abandoning him. And I say all of this from the position of a young man who has disagreements with Nick on things like Islam, for example. He's a lot softer on it than I am because he has Muslim friends and he thinks the real issue is the undue influence of Jewish diasporas on American and Western politics. And I tell you what, if you wanted to prove him wrong, having Danny Finkelstein zoom in with a pre-recorded message displaying the hypocrisy of demanding that Israel gets to be an ethno-state for Jews, whereas we must use the Holocaust and Hitler to insist that Europe remains liberal, multicultural, and actually that it keeps in place the same international laws that are flooding our country with unwanted foreign criminals and mass migration, because otherwise, as he writes in this piece here, which I covered in a previous video linked down in the description, otherwise his own parents wouldn't have been able to come in as refugees. I think if you wanted to try and sustain that post-war moral order, that exception carved out for Israel that Europe, America, and the UK can't enjoy, the worst thing to do was put Danny Finkelstein in front of Nick Fuentes and allow him to laugh in his face. So, to sum up, for those who have been concerned about Fuentes' rhetoric, terrified by his rise to prominence, who think that he's inflammatory and insulting, and they believe all of the worst possible characterizations that his detractors have made about him. First of all, you have to give the devil his due, otherwise you'll never be able to counteract him. He's very talented. He's an exceptional broadcaster. He is very funny. Even people that disagree with him find him hilarious. And nobody on the other side of politics to him comes close in terms of broadcasting acumen and the ability to command the loyalty of young men. And also, perhaps ask yourself this: why is it that there are no other under-30s prominent commentators in America on the right that could pose even the remotest challenge to Nick Fuentes? There's barely any in the UK. The market's tiny. Why did he become the #1 live streamer in America, despite being the most cancelled? Is it because this post-war old guard were unwilling to foster young talent to listen to their concerns? Was it because the likes of the Republican Party and the Conservatives chased marginal gains among minorities to prove that they weren't racist according to the post-war moral order, and neglected the majority of the country, the young white men that uphold its institutions, to whom its culture beats most warmly in their chest, who love the land and have loyalty there and wanted to raise their families there and won't just cut and run if the economic situation worsens? Is Nick Fuentes your fault? And I would say yes, and that's why getting him to denounce his own clips according to your morality, which he and his audience utterly rejects because it hasn't given them anything, it's actually destroyed the country that they hope to raise a family in, just isn't going to work.